Leonard Peltier is somebody's whose story has been extremely uh, meaningful to my life. I mean, it's been something that once I was first aware of it, it really opened up a lot of kind of political doors and perspectives, and it really breaks my heart, frankly, to still be talking about this case and begging for his freedom from a government who were involved in the prosecution have now admitted that the case had very serious red flags and called for his freedom. And twice now, we've seen Democratic administrations. I mean, not more, but in a time where you thought maybe something would be finally done about it, just sort of turned their back. I'm going to go through the story who Leonard Peltier was, and what this really means. But I highly suggest that people who are watching this and are motivated for it, finding ways to get involved. I mean, literally going out and just spreading awareness. Free Leonard Peltier hashtag, the Leonard Peltier Defense Fund, and organizations like that are worth, in the Leonard Peltier International Defense Fund are worthwhile to check out, because it does seem like there's a lot of momentum on this right now, particularly because Leonard Peltier just was tested positive for COVID. And let me read this quote here, and then I'll take y'all through this story. This is a statement that he released last Friday, where he says, "I'm in hell, and there's no way to deal with it but to take it as long as you can." Um, he has been, again, in his own words, left alone without attention. This is like a torture chamber for the sick and old because of COVID protocols in the prison that he is in. He's essentially held, and he's been held in solitary confinement for years upon years now. He and because of COVID protocols, he's been denied even the small amount of time where he was able to interact with people and get outside of his cell. He desperately needs people on the outside to be speaking up for this, not only because it's an injustice to him, but his political persecution is meant to kind of instill fear in Native American and Indigenous activists in the United States and around the world.
Yeah, there's no legal experts that actually think that he's responsible for the murders. The FBI was pissed that two other guys got off because the state of North
Mhm.
Dakota was, or I think it was North Dakota judge. Maybe I'm misremembering that, but
Yeah.
was willing to consider the wider context of that there were fucking violent goon squads, driving around with guns and shooting people. And I mean, this is really like, does the Joe Biden administration, and we're finding out, I mean, hopefully he does something. I agree, like, and send like maybe a form letter to your representative if you got a
Yes, absolutely.
decent one. But is Biden as lacking in courage as his predecessors when it comes to righting a wrong that a lawless FBI and lawless law enforcement in this country want to continue, because they want him in jail, caged with coronavirus, for the message that it sends to folks. He's arrested when he was 33. That's how old I am now. He's been there a
He's
decade longer than
77.
that, right? And it's because of the message. Same with Mumia Abu Jamal. Like that, they're in there because of the message. Again, like you look at the stuff legally, everyone's like, yeah, this is bullshit. They're there for the message.
So let me tell his story, because it really highlights a lot of this radical history that is so critical to understand why this is so important. Leonard Peltier, like many other people in his generation, he grew up through this horrible period of termination. We're learning so many horrible stories about what's going on in the United States. It is still going on, but we're finding these mass grave sites in Canada and also investigating them in the United States as well. Leonard Peltier, like many of the other members of AIM, was one of these children who was taken away and was forced to unlearn their language, was forced to practice Christianity, was taken away from their culture and their community and their family. And then was sort of forced off into the world with no protections. This is what termination was. The idea was that they were going to finally complete the cultural genocide against the indigenous peoples to this continent. It was an absolutely brutal policy that still has effects on people around today.
Yeah.
In response to this, Leonard Peltier joined up with organizations like AIM, the American Indian Movement. and it's worthwhile to note that Peltier was not just sort of like a passive member of these organizations. He participated in the occupation of Alcatraz. Alcatraz sits on native land that is actually stipulated in a treaty. To to belong to native peoples. So AIM went and they occupied the site, demanding that it was returned to native people. Leonard Peltier was also, I believe, present at the AIM occupation of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in D.C. And when they occupied that building, one that was an extremely embarrassing moment for the government, because this mass movement of people that was extremely sympathetic was showing the brutality of the American government. And when they were inside of the BIA, the AIM movement found documents and records that cataloged a program of forced sterilization of Native American women. I mean, this is some of the most disgusting examples of modern day continuation of the genocide against Native peoples, right? So there's this massive movement in the 70s where people are rising up, and there was a lot of political support for them because people were realizing, because so many people didn't recognize, because of policies like termination, what was happening in Indian country and what was happening to the people who were sort of forced into sterilization and this cultural genocide, right? So this is a very important moment that later sort of boils over into an armed conflict between the United States government and AIM and Wounded Knee, a site of another massacre um, by the U.S. Army only a century before. But essentially, to give people the short version of it, there's a lot that this is one of those things that like I highly suggest people spend some time to educate themselves about AIM. Maybe we should do an entire
Yeah.
show on it as well. But there's just so much to get into that we can't get we don't want to get too distracted. But um, what's happening here is on the Pine Ridge Reservation, which is still in a state of severe disrepair and underfunding today. There was essentially a elected government, but it was effectively an organized gang with the collaboration of the local U.S. government authorities and the FBI to basically hold down and to abuse people within that community. And these kind of gangs of people, what they called, the goons, would go around and they would harass folks, particularly people who were involved in AIM. Eventually, this goes into a huge occupation, an armed conflict with the government. That was a very famous moment in American history. It's like one of the few times that there have been tanks leveraged against American citizens in recent memory. This occupation happens as a huge embarrassment for the FBI and the U.S. government in general. And I just want to note here that collective punishment is rightly considered a violation of human rights.
Hmm.
And following the occupation of Wounded Knee, we saw this mass collective punishment of people in Pine Ridge, members of the Pine Ridge community. They faced this reign of terror from Dick Clark, who was the kind of appointed by the U.S. government and U.S. Government allies authority figure in the region. Around 64 people were murdered in Pine Ridge. Their murders were never investigated. We still don't know what happened there. And during this period of time, Leonard Peltier is tried under these dubious charges. What is he charged for? While these goons are sort of wandering around and harassing people, and as I was alleging earlier, people were being found dead, Leonard Peltier and a few other people were on a location near Pine Ridge. And there's a long story that goes into this, but effectively, some people show up with guns and start firing at you in your household in a period of time when folks were in high alert. Some people return fire, and there's a shootout that goes on for a period of time.
Nobody's in
Um,
uniform, I should also say.
Nobody's in uniform, unmarked, unannounced. Some people show up outside your house and they start firing at you. Again, in a climate where people have been being murdered in their homes, in a climate where people are being intimidated and beat by Dick Clark and other kind of dubious and despicable characters. So again, this is America, right? What happened to the right to defend yourself? Anyway. People involved run and they run and they run, And Leonard Peltier actually ends up on the other side of the border. A few people get tried in the Dakotas, and they end up getting let off scot-free because the charges against them were so dubious and so absurd, that even the kind of American judge was able to recognize that there were significant problems with the American case here. Um, then Leonard Peltier is basically promised that if he comes back to the United States, he will not be charged. Big lie. He gets arrested immediately, and he does not face he does not sit in front of the same judge or the same kind of fair trial that these first people got. Effectively, the FBI completely fabricates this case against him, particularly the weapons that they ended up claiming that were used to fire the bullet that killed the officer. Um, they use falsified evidence to try to make it seem like it came from a gun that Leonard Peltier owned. They also forced and intimidated a woman in the community who Leonard Peltier had never known, to present herself as his girlfriend, and say that, basically give testimony that made it seem like Peltier had one, committed the murders, and two, had intent. That person has now recanted that testimony, saying that she was threatened by them,
Should be
and
a
members of her
scandal.
family were threatened
Yeah.
by them as well. Despite all of this, Leonard Peltier continues to sit in prison. Again, we were saying now, he was 33 when he went into prison. He's 77 now. He's now spent the vast majority of his life in prison, more life behind bars, more lives in a cage, than as a free man. And for what? Um, Not because the FBI was looking for justice, not because the U.S. government had a legitimate case against somebody, but because they wanted to show somebody as they wanted to make a threat. They wanted to make an example of Peltier to try to tamp down the American Indian movement, because they were afraid of what was happening when more and more people across the country were seeing the injustices of what's going on in Indian country, and seeing the injustices of the cultural and physical genocide against Native American people. And I just want to add two last things on this, because we have some really good clips we're going to go to as well. But I want to read this quote here, because this is the shit that drives me crazy about it. I made that case because that's the right case, right? That's the case that we have from the facts. And we've known these facts for a long time. Hell, we knew them going into this case. But now the people who were involved in the prosecution, the people who were involved in the case, have come forward and they have said, yeah, this guy should be let free. So this is one of the former FBI agents on the case. Former agent John C. Jack Ryan wrote in a letter, "In my opinion, the circumstances surrounding the case, in combination with the passage of 4 decades of time, serve support his request to live his final years at home." And this is going back to 2017, by the way, y'all. James Reynolds, who was the U.S. attorney on the case, right? This is the guy who brings the case against him. This is the guy who spent time studying it, prosecuted it. This is what he said. James Reynolds, U.S. attorney on the case: "You're not really participating in the crime yourself." He's talking about Leonard Peltier. "Just because you're there, you're going to get nailed." Reynolds has added, he didn't go out there with the intention to kill anybody. He was trying to protect his people. And many, many other people, and I believe Reynolds himself, have signed letters saying that it is time to end. Sorry. James Reynolds, former U.S. attorney on the case, has come forward and said that Leonard Peltier should be freed. Right at this point, the case itself speaks on its own 2 feet, but we now have the people involved saying that, hey, this guy should be freed. And the cowardice that we saw from Obama when he refused to free him, when he absolutely could have,
Yep.
is despicable. And Biden should show some backbone. And again, I wanted to remind people, because we're giving you all a lot of information here, why these figures are so important. Now, this is Leonard in his own words, if you have that video,
Yep.
talking about his life. And I believe this is in 2001, from a Free Speech TV interview that he did on political prisoners.
One of the things I learned when I was traveling around is that I always thought, growing up on a reservation, I always thought it was just Indian people that were being mistreated, right? I became a migrant worker for a while. I started with my uncle, and we started following the crops, the fruit crops. And I was down in California, and by Sacramento, and we were down by this river, and all of these migrant workers that I seen were poor white people. And some of the treatment that I seen them receive from the local law enforcement agencies and the townspeople, the business people, it was quite a shock to me. I just didn't believe, I couldn't believe that other people were being mistreated and treated the way I had, or my people had been treated, right? So my education began to advance, and realizing that the enemy is only going to creating one class of people, and if you're not that class of people, he's going to mistreat you. And that's the middle class and upper middle class people in the United States. But that whole era, that whole lifespan that I went through was very educational. In an area that was sad. It was very sad to see some of the treatment that I've seen some people being treated, especially my people. I mean, I've seen my people killed. I've seen my people. I've seen police brutality that was sickening. I mean, it made Rodney King beating look like a slap on the wrist. There's one incident that we fought so hard for to get these police officers arrested. Was in Seattle, Washington. They were with the canine department of the police station, right? They were training their dogs, so they went up to this hotel where all the Indians stayed. Sure, these were Indian alcoholics, winos and stuff. But they went in, kicked the doors down, and sicked their dogs on them, tore these people all up. I mean, that was just evil cruelty, But things like that that's what I was against. That's what I wanted to see change. I wanted the right to be able to walk the street and not be mistreated because my hair was black and my skin was brown, or if I looked like an Indian or a Mexican or wherever. I wanted to be able to go into a store and buy whatever I wanted. I wanted to be able to have a job wherever I wanted to, wherever I was qualified for.
Yeah, that was Leonard Peltier again in 2001. 21 more years in prison, and from all the reports that we've gotten, his treatment has only gotten worse, and he's been moved further and further and further away from his ancestral lands. The last that I knew, he was in Florida, and again now he has COVID. It's 44 years. Leonard Peltier is a political prisoner. The people involved have asked for him to be freed. This is as simple as it gets. You can do the right thing, Joe Biden. Let Leonard Peltier go.
Yeah, absolutely. And just to also note that the treatment of all prisoners in this country, the number one jailer of any country on earth, has been horrendous too. And we should probably do some coverage on that more broadly. But
no doubt about it.
Have some courage, Joe. I'd love to be surprised. I would love, nothing would make me happier than being surprised.
I'm very encouraged. I want to bring the weight of this story. So, I don't want to do it as an uplifting kind of thing up front, but there has been a lot of movement from people like Danny DeVito and Susan Sarandon, who continue time and time again to fearlessly champion the right causes, despite all the flack that they get from the nastiest little critters in the media. But beyond that, there have been a lot of movements in politics. A lot of Native officials and elected officials particularly have, now that there's more representation in government than we've ever seen, have been trying to bring this case up. But we need a lot more, and we need more eyes on this. And, hopefully this uprising that we've been seeing in response to him catching COVID and the horrible treatment that he's faced, we can leverage that. And so this is a time right now, if you have the ability, if you can think of any way to, increase people's awareness of this, as Matt was saying, I think sending letters is great. Bring this to Joe Biden. This is an easy win at this point, that he can get. And I desperately want to see Leonard Peltier walk free.
It'd be incredible.
Well, on this, we have something else. This is another member of AIM, Vernon Bellecourt, who was a member of AIM, and a freedom fighter in his own way. We found this really great clip here. This is from Bernie Sanders' old public access show when he was mayor of Burlington. And this is just talking about the kind of justice of the indigenous struggle in general, but also its international angle. And I figured it was worthwhile sharing. I think this is from 1987 here.
And some of the contradictions that I like to focus on is the fact that here in the United States, the United States continues to pass laws to force the Navajo people from their land at Big Mountain. We just filed a suit in the U.S. Supreme Court 3 days ago through the assistance of Michael Ratner of the Center for Constitutional Rights. It was in the New York Times yesterday on the White Earth Chippewa Reservation in northern Minnesota. In the 99th Congress, they passed a law that expropriates more than 200,000 acres of our land without our consent or without compensation. Our people are struggling to recover the sacred Black Hills, which they see as their Mecca, their sacred shrines, and they're having a great deal of difficulty doing that. So the point that I always try to emphasize is that there's no doubt that the American war against the indigenous people in the United States continues. Certainly it's not the Gatling gun and the saber, but it's the Congress of the United States and various federal courts making rulings that adversely affect us.
Tell us, because again, I think many of our views, and I certainly am not as aware of and understand as much as I should. What is the economic condition of the American Indian now in the United States?
Well, no doubt, the people who first gave sanctuary to immigrants from all over the world who came here to flee from economic, spiritual, political persecution in their own countries reversed their role almost immediately, and the oppressed peoples of the world became the oppressor. And down through the years, for nearly 500 years, obviously, it's been a constant war to push us further and further from our sacred lands. Consequently, in a country where we, as the original landholders, I say landholders, we never thought we could own Mother Earth, should in fact be doing quite well. But we're at the bottom of every economic indicator in education, healthcare, housing, water systems. People who have visited some reservations said that they almost thought they were in a third world country in Central America, because essentially, over the years, the federal government, who's supposed to protect our lands and resources, have allowed its exploitation, and not to our benefit. In other words, we have remained locked into long cycles of poverty, which breeds all the other problems that we are faced with. So the condition across the board is not good at all.
Yeah, and the real tragedy there is this is 87, and Pine Ridge, you could still say the same thing about the state that it's in. Remember that the memory and the commitment of the American government to treaties that they've signed with other nations, the native nations of this continent, they always start to become less and less important when they find copper or nice minerals or uranium. As we're seeing these continued fights all across the country to respect ancestral, sacred, and also treaty designated lands. People were forced off of the most profitable lands, right? The lands that had the most resources, and put into lands that did not have the same capacity. Pine Ridge is an example of this, right? And as a part of that, the United States government was supposed to provide food, health care, and adequate lodging to those people. See what the U.S. government provides. Go online and see what the United States government provides to the people of Pine Ridge. It is despicable to do that to people. They send them food that has been expired, and they refuse to upgrade and update people's homes, even as they fall into disrepair. And it's truly a crisis that has just been going on for centuries at this point. But it's really nice I highly suggest if people could find it, maybe we could get a link to it for folks. The entire conversation with Sanders and Vernon there is a really interesting one, because it's primarily focused on the question of Nicaragua and the indigenous movements in Bolivia, and how they might sort of show a different way of building power and building a kind of socialism. And I think that socialists in this country should take it upon themselves to make sure that the real fight, the material fight, for Indigenous peoples is a part of your vocabulary and your movement, and not just in a kind of symbolic way that is becoming very popular
Yeah.
with a lot of kind of liberals and corporations today.
An aesthetic kind of way. Yeah, exactly. What?